Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments, but if there is an empty seat next to you, if you wouldn't mind scooting in or raising your hand and letting people in the back know that there's a seat available. If you all want to come forward, make new friends, we have a couple empty seats here towards the front. No takers? There's several seats up front here to my right. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program. We're so honored to have such an amazing turnout. My name is Megan Rust, and I'm the educator for interpretation here at the Frist Art Museum. If anyone in the back is looking for a seat, there still are a few up here at the front. Please feel free to come on down while I'm introducing tonight's program. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum acknowledges and pays respect to the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples and elders who call this land we are standing on their homeland. We also acknowledge and offer deep gratitude to the ancestral land and water that support us. Tonight's curator's perspective is presented in conjunction with the exhibition J.M.W. Turner, Quest for the Sublime, on view in our Ingram galleries until May 31st. Quest for the Sublime is an exhibition of works selected from Tate's Turner bequest and was organized in cooperation with Tate. Here with us this evening, we are privileged to have Elizabeth Brooke, exhibitions project manager from Tate, and David Blayney Brown, senior curator of 19th century British art, who will also lead our lecture tonight. At this time, please take a moment to silence your cell phones while I gratefully acknowledge our sponsors for J.M.W. Turner Quest for the Sublime. Platinum sponsor HCA Foundation on behalf of HCA TriStar Health, supporting sponsor Christie's, hospitality sponsor Union Station Hotel, education and community engagement sponsor, the Wingate Foundation. And J.M.W. Turner, The Quest for the Sublime, is supported in part by the 2020 Frisk Gala patrons. As always, we are grateful for the continuing operating support from Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Now it is my pleasure to introduce David Blayney Brown. As I said, he is the Senior Curator of 19th Century British Art at the Tate and is one of the world's leading experts on Turner. He's written numerous monographs on artists of the Romantic era. Please join me in welcoming David Blayney Brown.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome everyone. An enormous turnout on a freezing cold evening. I'm going to say a few words about Turner himself, and then try and provide a little bit of context for this exhibition, also with some personal reflections. What I'm not going to be giving is an art history lecture. It's going to be a little bit more personal than that, I think. Turner's having something of a moment at present. We have the exhibition just opening here now. We have had a touring exhibition of Turner watercolours, also from the Tate incidentally, but it's primarily as a tribute to Turner, of course, which has been until very recently in Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. We are currently preparing an exhibition for London this autumn called Turner's Modern World, which is going to be about Turner as a painter of his own life and times. What it emphatically is not going to be an exhibition about is Turner as a proto-modernist in an art historical sense. It's going to be about Turner and his engagement with what was modern in his own lifetime. But after the showing in London, in the course of next year, that exhibition will move on to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and then to the Kimball in Fort Worth. And a few hours earlier, I think, if I judge things right, and I'm hopeless with numbers and time differences and things like that, but a few hours ago, I think, the new £20 UK banknote was launched, as it happens, at Tate Britain in the Claw Gallery for the Turner Bequest, with Turner's self-portrait on one side and Turner's Fighting Temeraire on the other. And so that choice of Turner for the £20 note was made by the British public by ballot, and it shows that Turner is as important for people today as he was in his lifetime. I'm going to talk a bit today about Turner himself, just by way of introduction, and then I'm going to move on to Turner as a painter of the sublime, which is really the sort of sub-theme of this exhibition, Turner's quest for the sublime. But perhaps as we walk around the exhibition, we might feel that we're rather in quest of the sublime for us ourselves. And I'd like to just try and unpack a little what the idea of the sublime meant in Turner's time and what it still means to us today. Joseph Mallord William Turner is known today as one of the greatest, and some would say the greatest, and as a Turner specialist I couldn't possibly comment, one of the greatest British painters of his generation, and not only in Britain, but one of the greatest European artists too, and I do like to bang that European drum just to ignore, to annoy all the Brexiteers in England. Born in 1775 and dying in 1851, his career spanned a time of extraordinary change and advancement in politics, society, and technology. And his career progressed alongside the rupture and trauma of the French Revolution, the many years of war with Napoleonic France ending in 1815. His uniqueness as an artist and his high reputation in his lifetime and since has rested partly on the technical aspects of his work, his handling, colouring, appreciation of light, colour, atmosphere, climate, and the elements of the natural world. And those aspects of his work, I think, often seem to modernize, to bridge the gap between his own time and the French Impressionist painters of the later 19th century, or even when they exert a reductive effect on his later work, they seem perhaps to anticipate the American abstract and expressionist artists of the mid-20th century. If Turner was not exactly a 19th century Jackson Pollock, no less a painter than Mark Rothko turned time inside out and upside down and said, "That guy Turner, he learned a lot from me." If Turner is sometimes taken by those sorts of remarks out of time altogether, we should never forget his exceptional ability to catch the mood and tempo of the time in which he lived, the spirit of the age, and that it was a phrase that was very popular in Turner's lifetime. It was felt to be a special period, a special era, with a character and a spirit of its own. And the state of the nation and the European continent, Europe again, there we go, in his lifetime. The appeal that his work made isn't just, I think, an aesthetic one, powerful as his visual language was. It was also emotional and imaginative. And in some important respects, his emotional and imaginative world was and always remained an 18th century one. He had, after all, been born in 1775. And that is even as he adapted to the dynamic and transformative conditions of the 19th century modern world. To get the images up, which do I press? Is it the... yeah. This is certainly true of his interest in and engagement with the sublime, an aesthetic and emotive idiom that has its origins in antiquity as a category of literary style, but had come into focus in the mid-18th century. Turner's sublime is a major theme of this exhibition. It is, after all, part of the title, and the exhibition explores various kinds of sublimity in Turner's work. But often people talk about the sublime, but they don't often define it. How does it apply to Turner? Turner, who is seen here in a self-portrait painted about 1799, we think, to mark his election as Associate of the Royal Academy, where he had been exhibiting his work for a few years by then, and where he had studied art. The writer Joseph Addison had explored the literary implications of the sublime in The Spectator, a London journal which is still published today, but is a lot less interesting nowadays than it was in the 18th century, in The Spectator in 1712. But the key 18th century text, which Turner certainly knew very well, was by the Irish Tory politician and philosopher Edmund Burke. Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas and the sublime and beautiful was published in 1757. The key words in that title are philosophical, ideas, and beautiful. Burke defines the sublime in broad conceptual and perceptual terms rather than artistic or aesthetic ones, and by what the sublime is not as much as by what it is. He relates our appreciation of external phenomena, the kind of phenomena that are the business of a landscape artist like Turner to try to understand and depict. He relates those phenomena to our elemental and natural human responses. Thus, we decide what is beautiful in much the same way, the much the same instinctive way that we feel and respond to physical and sexual attraction. And what is sublime by recognizing what arouses, and I quote directly from Burke, ideas of pain or danger. Beautiful things are gentle and reassuring, sublime ones vast, dangerous, and awe-inspiring. So far so good, or at least I hope so, but Burke took his readers a step further. He tries to explain that there was also pleasure to be derived from the sublime, a frisson, an excitement, a thrill. This was particularly so in pictures which represented sublime things at a safe distance, as it were on the edge of our perceptions. It was one thing, for example, to be actually clinging to the edge of a dizzying mountain pass, pursued perhaps by a wolf or a bear, or enveloped by a blizzard, or gripping the rail of a sinking ship in a howling storm, but quite another to look at these things in the comfort of an exhibition or a gallery of art. In these conditions, horror was mixed with something approaching delight. And Burke himself used those words, horror and delight, when explaining the effects of things that were sublime. I don't think it's a coincidence that the sublime in pictures and the various thrills and fears it induced became so important at the same time as the Enlightenment was supposedly making people more rational and level-headed, and also at the same time as advanced nations like Britain were becoming urbanized and industrial. The lure of the wild in the mind or in nature was a form of escapism and a return to a more natural or primitive state. Wild, untamed landscapes, seas, storms, and so on, were obvious subjects for the sublime in art, and they were well represented by Turner, brilliantly represented, as we can see in this exhibition, or at least I hope we can. But we can also see in this exhibition how Turner modernized the sublime, taking it in new directions, from the natural to the man-made. What I want to try and do this evening is to suggest some Turnerian sublimes, some interchangeable, some distinct, that we might recognize as we walk around the show. And I've invented some names for them, types of sublime that you probably won't find in any of the critical literature, but I think which have some value as one looks at Turner's pictures. And here they are, and I shall expect to be shot down by all sorts of critics. The light sublime, and here I shall be including darkness as the necessary opposite of light, like beauty as it stands in relation to the sublime itself, according to Burke's distinction. The mountain sublime, the ocean sublime, the urban sublime, and the mechanical sublime. I offer these in the same sort of spirit that Turner himself categorized landscape art in the series of prints of landscape imagery of different types that he called the Liber Studiorum and published over a number of years from around 1807. Turner spoke of the categories of landscape as being mountainous, marine, architectural, historic, pastoral, and epic or elevated, which are more idyllic and idealizing pastoral. And of course, all such taxonomies are suspect, since they can't capture everything, or alternatively, they're likely to overlap. But I think, nevertheless, they have some value. And I'm going to apply that same sort of distinguishing approach to Turner's sublimes. People usually talk about the sublime as a singular thing. I think it has potentially various aspects to it. You're probably thinking I'm not going to show you any pictures, aren't you? But actually, here goes. Let's start with the light sublime. Turner's first exhibited oil painting, which is in the exhibition, in fact it's the first picture you see as you walk in, was also the first oil painting that Turner exhibited at the Royal Academy. He'd been showing watercolours there for some years already, but he only really started painting in oil in the mid-1790s, and this was the first oil painting on canvas that he ever exhibited. It's called Fisherman at Sea, and it's certainly a case of the light sublime, even though it's nighttime and in the dark, which is also why it's sublime. In his lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres, published in 1783, the literary critic Hugh Blair ruled that, and I quote, "Night scenes are commonly the most sublime." Turner shows moonlight, but also lamplight from the fishermen's lanterns. So there's a contrast of the natural and artificial light. The heave and swell of the sea, what one reviewer at the time called the undulation of the element, points to the marine sublime in many of Turner's later pictures, what I call this evening the ocean sublime. Perhaps it makes us feel slightly seasick, but I think that there's also a wider feeling of unease and disquiet in this picture, which I think rather sort of trumps the sense of calm that one might also get from it. It's set off the Isle of Wight on Britain's south coast, and the coast of France, with which Britain is of course at war at this time and has been for 3 years. The war began with the French revolutionary and radical government. It had begun in 1793. Here we are in 1796. The war's been going on for 3 years. Invasion is expected at any time, and it will come from this direction, from somewhere in the distance. Fishermen and coastal communities are prey to press gangs rounding up men for the Royal Navy. None of this is made explicit in the picture, but it would have been on people's minds at the time when they saw it in the London exhibition. And one of Turner's qualities, observed by a contemporary reviewer, was that he made people see and think of much more than the objects immediately before them. Colour, of course, is also important to this picture. It has this curious sort of greeny, bluish palette that, of course, is partly the effect of night, but I think it also induces a certain sort of feeling of melancholy and perhaps also of apprehension. Turner's early pictures are often dark in colour, as if they were metaphors for troubled times, the new age of anxiety that was opening up as the war seemed likely to last for many years. Only later, after the war, did Turner's art really emerge into the light, and did he begin to flood his pictures with sunshine and colour. And by way of complete contrast, which we can also see in the exhibition, if we look at this Italian landscape, which Turner painted during some years, some months staying in Rome in 1828, of course, it's completely at the opposite spectrum, not only in terms of color, but also emotional. It's vivid, it's bright, it sort of hits us in the eye with this dazzling glow, and it seems to be optimistic and cheerful in its impact, whereas I think the Fisherman at Sea is quite different. And also in the exhibition again, the marvelous sun setting over a lake, which is a picture completely without subject except the power of sunlight. Turner's supposed to have said on his deathbed, the sun is God. I don't think he actually did. By other accounts, what he said was, and he said this to his doctor, go downstairs and have another glass of sherry. Believe what you will. But the dazzle of sunlight, this extraordinary impression that it makes, sun dipping down, lighting up a whole sky still with a ruddy glow and reflected on water. This takes us towards the light sublime in its lightest aspect. But for people of Turner's generation, when it came to history painting, and one of the categories of the sublime that artists, historians do sometimes talk about, but which I'm not going to be talking about this evening, because I think it is really not as important as some of the other aspects that I'd like to draw attention to, that art historians tend to talk about the historical sublime, landscapes with history going on in them, landscapes with subjects, and they often are also painted in the manner of old masters. And of course, if a painting was 150 or 200 years old in Turner's time, it was often very dirty and very dark, even if it hadn't been dark in the first place. And this idea grew up that really serious pictures with important and significant historical subjects and some kind of moral value behind them had to be dark in color. In the course of time, Turner completely overthrew that idea, and some of his most meaningful pictures are also some of the most brilliant. But when it comes to a subject like the biblical deluge, painted here in a picture exhibited in 1805, of course, a dark palette is appropriate because we have this terrible raging storm and torrential rain, and we have a kind of tidal wave of floodwater approaching from the left. We have the surging flood in the foreground, and the darkness of the waves, the darkness of the sky, the sun dipping down in the distance, a kind of age of darkness descending on the world. The biblical flood, of course, was an act of ultimate destruction from which only a few selected creatures and a few chosen people will be saved. It's a picture about fear and terror. One of the things that caused fear and terror in Turner's lifetime, and people were beginning to campaign against, was the slave trade. And the trade itself and its onslaught on ethics and human rights, the torture and terror that it inflicted on its victims, was something that, in the eyes of abolitionist campaigners, whom many were beginning to be active in the early 19th century, deserved the strongest of divine punishments. And I think we can judge Turner's own sympathies in that debate from the heroic and not at all subjugated or subordinate figure of the black man, the very muscular, strong black man in the right foreground, who is trying to rescue white women from the waters. And we'll see in a few moments the painting that Turner painted in 1840 as a judgment, really, on the slave trade at a time when the ban on slavery and the slave trade that had been introduced in Britain and throughout the British Empire, there was an effort to extend that ban across the world. Later, in 1828, when Turner published a print of this picture, this 1805 deluge, he actually dedicated the print to an abolitionist campaigner, the Earl of Carysfort. But, and this is perhaps surprising, and certainly to many of us today, it's something that we would wish had not happened, Turner's own conscience was compromised in relation to slavery, because about the same time as he painted this picture, he also invested £100 by buying a single share in a tontine scheme to buy a cattle ranch in Jamaica, which was going to be worked, according to the advertisements for it in the London press, by a large gang of Negroes. So of course, we all know only too well what that meant. Did he feel guilty, I wonder? Was his conscience troubled? It's hard to say. Perhaps this picture was a way of somehow trying to come to terms with and atone for an action that he had already come to regret, or maybe he was able to separate one aspect of his activity completely from another. It's hard to say. But certainly it's clear how his views evolved over the years. The contrasts of darkness and brilliance in Turner's pictures is striking, and it's something that I hope comes across very strongly from this exhibition. And overall, moving through it, we can see that his pictures grow lighter and brighter, that his palette becomes more vivid and brilliant, and that he leaves dark, on the whole, behind. But sometimes he contrasts darkness and light at the same time, or in pairs of pictures, as if he knows that there's darkness and light in all of us, that the one depends on the other, and that they alternate like light and day. And they are also perhaps a metaphor for the cycles of life and nature themselves. When he returned to the subject of the deluge in the 1840s, as again we can see in the exhibition, and he painted these two pictures, he contrasts light and shade and opposing ends of the spectrum. Morning after the deluge, the more vividly coloured picture, the evening before the deluge beside it. Turner had been reading Goethe's theory of colour, which was translated into English by a friend of his, Charles Eastlake, and Goethe really wanted to explore the emotional values of the different ends of the spectrum, so that the dark end of the colour spectrum is associated with negative and downbeat and frightening and depressing and melancholy things, and of course the bright end of the spectrum with their opposite. And I think in 1807, 2 years after he painted his first deluge, when giving a lecture at the Royal Academy, Turner said that light is therefore colour. You need light to create or illuminate colour, but you also need darkness to offset it. And vivid colour is more effective when set against dark. And so although overall the exhibition shows that Turner moved from a dark to a light palette, we can also see that sometimes he wants to contrast the two. The one can only live with the other. Mountains, the mountain sublime. Something again that we can see in the exhibition. Mountains, the steeper and wilder and more rugged the better, were powerfully sublime experiences, whether they were avoided, looked at from a safe distance, or crossed on the way to somewhere else. The horrors of an alpine crossing on the way to Italy and back were a necessary price to pay for an 18th century grand tour and a proper study of the beauties of Rome and Naples. But the idea that one might make mountains a destination in themselves to be climbed, skied, or stayed in hotels was unimaginable in Turner's lifetime and incomprehensible to all but a few of the most enterprising pioneers. Among those pioneers was Turner. He liked to face mountains head-on. One of the interesting things about Turner is that from quite a young age, he started to travel every summer. He was a roving artist. He lived in London, he had his studio in London, but he spent his summers traveling around with sketchbooks in his pocket, his pencils and his watercolors, making drawings, collecting images, bringing them back to London, working on them during the winter and turning them into pictures. Pictures like this, Morning on the Coniston Fells, painted and exhibited in 1798. It's a scene of the English Lake District, where there are things sort of vaguely approaching mountains, not real mountains, but nearly mountains. Here is a picture of them. And this is a case, I think, of how Turner's sublimes sometimes coalesce and come together, because obviously if we accept the premise of a mountain sublime and we accept the premise of a light sublime, we can see that those two aspects are combined. It's early morning, the sun is rising in the sky, it's warming the atmosphere, it's spreading its light gradually across a still dark and shadowy landscape. The morning mist is beginning to disperse. The light is picking up the splash and spray of a stream running across the foreground. Sheep are starting to run down the slopes, perhaps attracted by the first gleams of sunlight as they cross the slopes of the hills. Everything in this picture is in flux. Everything is moving. It's the most extraordinary image. It's not a big picture, but it's full of activity. And the whole natural world seems to be alive. And whereas I think sometimes the sublime in Burke's concept is a frightening and alarming thing, in a picture like this, it comes very close to beauty, even though Burke distinguished the two. And if one wants any sort of early sense of what a wonderful landscape painter and painter of the natural world that Turner was going to become, then we see it in this picture. And here is the kind of watercolor on which a picture like the Coniston Fells would have been based. This isn't in the same part of the country. This is actually the mountain of Trethmora in Wales. My partner Steve is here somewhere in the audience. He learnt Welsh at Aberystwyth University and will no doubt tell me that my Welsh pronunciation is terrible. But anyway, it doesn't matter where it is. It's in North Wales. It's a watercolour dating from 1799. And in a case like this, of course, Turner's looking at a mountain from a certain distance away. He's still in a flat and calm and relatively placid lowland landscape and looking at a mountain in the distance. But he found mountains so exciting by this time that he wanted to get right into them and to climb them. And his taste for mountains that he developed in Wales and Scotland and the Lake District in Britain was something that he wanted to develop further. And so when there was a break in the Napoleonic Wars in 1802, following a treaty that had been signed at Amiens, he was able to cross over to France, travel south through France, and spend 3 weeks tramping about in the Alps. And in that sense, he was able to penetrate right into mountain scenery rather than looking at it from a distance. And there's a room across the way devoted to Turner's Swiss work, particularly the drawings and studies, and in one case a painting based on that 1802 trip. And it was really a formative experience for Turner, coming to grips with mountain scenery at its most spectacular and striking, and sometimes frightening and awe-inspiring, a truly sublime experience which we can still share today. And if we look at this watercolour, which is in the show, we can see how it's a ravine in the pass of St. Gothard. It shows how really Turner has got right into the landscape. It's now surrounding him. This cleft seems to be opening up in front of him and almost swallowing him up. It's as if he wants to get as close to the rocks and the trees and this sort of dizzying gap in the rock, as close to all that as he possibly can. And I think in an image like this, there's something almost physical and perhaps even sexual about it. It's an extraordinary image. And these memories from 1802 really lived in Turner's mind. And I think it was in Switzerland in 1802 that a kind of iron entered his soul as a landscape painter. It made him more profound in the way that he looked at and painted the natural world. And one of the outcomes from that trip came a few years later, in 1810, when he exhibited this avalanche in the Grison. He never saw an avalanche. He wasn't in Switzerland at the time of year when avalanches happen. But what he had seen of the scenery of Switzerland, its geology, the damage that avalanches had done to trees, the effect that they'd had on sending rocks tumbling down slopes, smashing up chalets and buildings, and hearing the stories about the loss of life that they caused, he was able to imagine this picture. And if one wants to understand the terror and power and the fear factor implicit in the idea of the sublime, then this picture certainly expresses it. But I think it's also a picture that acts as a kind of a metaphor, because it isn't just about an avalanche, it isn't just about the natural world. The setting, the subject, the title is important. Turner tells us it is an avalanche in the Grison. And 2 years before he painted this picture, Napoleon's French army had taken over the Grison section of the Alps, an area that had previously been administered by Austria, and Napoleon forced the Austrians to cede that territory to him and to France. And secondly, there had recently been an avalanche in the Grison that had been reported in the London newspapers that had caused terrible loss of life. And I think in his imagination, Turner conflated the two. He remembered what he'd experienced in Switzerland in 1802, He looked back over his drawings and thought about how he might create a composition like this. He wanted to make a comment on the sort of aggressive force that Napoleon was in Europe at the time, and he came up with this picture, a picture of terror and power. There isn't a single human figure in it, although a rather eccentric conservator at the Tate has always said to me that there is actually a dead cat in it, and have I managed to find the dead cat yet? Well, the answer to that is no. Even though I've peered at every inch of it with a magnifying glass, I still haven't found the dead cat, and I don't know whether she's teasing me or not. One day I will get it out of her. From the land to the sea, the marine sublime. I quoted Hugh Blair a moment ago, and I'll quote him again. Hugh Blair, in 1783, he talks about the excessive grandeur of the ocean as being sublime not from its extent alone, but for the perpetual motion and irresistible force of that mass of waters. Another Scotsman, Dugald Stewart, in his philosophical essays published in 1810, the same year, incidentally, in which Turner exhibited his Avalanche in the Grison, declared that the idea of literal sublimity, and he put literal sublimity in italics, is inseparably combined with that of the sea, from the stupendous spectacle it exhibits when agitated by a storm. Turner was fascinated by the sea, from coast to open water, in every condition, from calm to the fiercest of storms. He loved ships. He had a boat himself, which he sailed up and down the Thames, and he enjoyed the company of sailors who brought back all sorts of stories from their travels. That wasn't unusual at the time. Today, I think it can be hard to imagine the significance of the sea for early 19th century Britain. It was, after all, a maritime nation. It was surrounded by stormy seas. It was threatened with invasion from France, an invasion, of course, that would have to come by water across the Channel. It was dependent on its navy and its merchant fleet for defense and for a range of vital imports. And you couldn't travel any distance without going by sea. Shipwrecks were frequent, and the loss of life they caused enormous. And they played, I think, on the sort of collective psyche of the nation in much the same way that today, if we dare to think about them, air crashes alarm us. Most of the time, of course, we manage to push them to the back of our minds. Certainly we get on planes. But I think for Turner's generation, they would have had that same sort of feeling, or they would try to suppress that same kind of feeling whenever they got a ship, on board a ship, to travel any distance. The sea certainly aroused the fear factor associated with the sublime. This is a picture that Turner painted for one of his early patrons, the Duke of Bridgewater, an extremely rich man who had a collection of old master paintings, and he asked Turner to paint a companion for one by the Dutch 17th century painter Van der Velde. And Turner came up with this, which is a sort of version of a Van der Velde composition, The Rising Gale, and Turner sort of reversed the imagery and modernized it and brought it up to date. It's quite a stormy picture, of course. We can see rather threatening storm clouds sweeping in from the right, or maybe it isn't like that. Maybe the storm is clearing and we can see clear sky spreading over from the other side. Who knows? The two fishing boats in the center seem poised between storm and something calmer. But nevertheless, they do seem relatively in control. Are they going to collide, or are they going to manage to separate? We don't really know. when he painted this picture, I don't think Turner had been very far or even anywhere on a ship. But by the time he painted this picture, Calais Pier, he certainly had. And what it shows is his experience in 1802, trying to land on the French coast on his way to Switzerland. When his ship arrived, the weather was extremely rough and stormy, and his boat wasn't able to approach the pier. It couldn't get into Calais harbour, and Turner had to get into a smaller boat and wade through the breakers onto the beach and got completely soaked. What we see here is his boat trying to approach the pier and nearly colliding with another boat that is trying to push off from it. We also see one of the smaller boats of the type that perhaps Turner then had to climb into to approach the beach. At one level, it's a drama about bad weather, and at another, it's about incompetent sailors. Are they going to be able to manage to negotiate their way out of this impasse, or is there going to be a sort of terrible smash-up of all these ships and boats? And of course, nowadays we think when we talk about the sublime, we talk about the sublime and the ridiculous. And we sometimes think that actually the difference between one and the other is actually quite small. One can easily tilt into the other. And I think we can perhaps sense that beginning to happen here. But nevertheless, I don't think it's very likely that anyone is actually going to lose their lives in this picture. But in this one, which was painted a few years later, they certainly will. The sea's so rough, the wind is so powerful, the ship breaking up so much, you can see it in the background on the right, that it can't be saved. Smaller boats are trying to rescue its passengers and crew, but they can hardly control themselves, let alone manage to haul the passengers from the bigger ship out of the water. It's a picture of that kind of pivots on the edge of disaster. We can almost hear the howling of the wind, and it's painted from a very low viewpoint, as if we as observers are either in the sea or in one of the smaller boats with the waves crashing and smashing around us. And in this picture, I'm sorry, it's a terrible image. It isn't by any means as blurred as this. Blame the Portuguese. It's in the Museu Calouste Gulbenkian in Lisbon. Not a very good reproduction, I'm afraid. Painted about 1810, the wreck of a transport ship. We can see Turner ramping up the drama and the horror even more. An old sailor, seeing this picture, said that no ship could live in such a sea. And, of course, nor can its passengers. You can't really see them, I'm afraid, but they're milling around in the water. Some fishing boats have arrived again. They're trying to rescue them, but clearly I don't think any boat, either the fishing boats, the transport ship that we can see looming in the background that is already breaking up, nothing really is going to get out of this alive. And what I think you probably can't see among the figures facing this extreme danger and on the point of drowning are two red-coated soldiers. And this, I think, brings me back again to this point about sort of pictures of natural storms and things like avalanches and storms at sea and so on as metaphors, because, of course, the war is still on. And of course, we can see the soldiers here at risk of imminent death and drowning. We can see them as a reminder that many soldiers at this time didn't actually die in battle. They died in storms and shipwrecks on their way overseas to serve or back home on leave. But I think we can also see the picture as a metaphor for the war itself, because here are these figures swept up in forces far larger than themselves that they can't possibly control. So I think it is a kind of image of war, as well as a terrifyingly realistic imagining of a natural catastrophe. The question that we've never really been able to answer about this picture is whether the catastrophe is real or not. Is it an actual event that Turner's read or heard about? The owner of the picture, who bought it in 1810, certainly thought so. He thought it represented the wreck of a ship called the Minotaur on the Hark Sands off the Dutch coast that had happened a few months before Turner painted the picture, but it can't represent that because in fact Turner had received that person's commission for this picture several months before the Minotaur was wrecked. So it's either some other event or it's not an event at all. It's a kind of imagining of the kind of thing that actually happens so often that it really, you take your pick. I mean, if you look at the records of shipwrecks for 1809 and 1810 alone, there would be maybe 20 or 30 a month with consequent loss of life. It's absolutely horrifying to read these statistics. We don't, however, have to ask whether the subject of this picture, which was painted about 1833, was real, because all the evidence suggests that it was. We think now that this represents the wreck of a convict ship called the Amphitrite that was on its way to Australia with a cargo of entirely female convicts and their infant children. And if one looks carefully at the picture, one can see that all the figures in it are women or babies or small children. There are no men in this picture as far as we can see. And it's extraordinary that at this time a picture like this would be painted with entirely female narrative. The Amphitrite was wrecked in a storm off the coast of France. The captain claimed that he was only instructed to land his cargo of convicts in Australia and nowhere else. If he landed them on the French coast, he was afraid they might escape. So he refused all offers of help from the French shore. And rather fittingly, he drowned himself, as indeed did everybody except 3 people who were on this ship. It was a terrible tragedy, and it was much reported at the time and used as an example to argue for a tightening up of maritime law and a more flexible approach to convict deportation. And in the case of the famous and horrific slave ship, wonderful picture in Boston that Turner painted in 1840, this, of course, is campaigning not only against the slave trade, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, but also for a change in the law regarding insurance. Because what this represents, some years after the event, is the appalling incident in 1781 when the captain of the slave ship Zong threw a number, or had thrown a number of sick and ill slaves on board his ship overboard because he would not get any insurance for sick slaves because, of course, they were thought to be valueless because if they were sick or if they then went on to die, they would have no value because they couldn't be sold at the point of disembarkation. This terrible event had happened in 1781. It came to court in 1783 in London. The captain was convicted, and this sort of stuck in people's memories of one of the most appalling incidents in the whole history of the slave trade. And that did not, however, prevent similar episodes happening for many years afterwards, because even though the British government banned slavery and the slave trade in Britain, in British waters, and then in the British Empire, slavery had not been banned globally. And when the Royal Navy, British Royal Navy, started to try and harass and stop slave ships from other countries traveling around and collecting slaves, if there were already slaves on board, their captains chucked them overboard to avoid being convicted of carrying slaves. And so this was all an appalling history. And why did Turner paint this when he did in 1840? It's because the British government had convened an international anti-slavery convention in London in 1840 with the objective of banning slavery throughout the world. It didn't, of course, entirely succeed. And this really was painted by Turner as a piece almost of propaganda to draw attention to the horrors of the trade and to the objectives of the convention that year. So here we have the horror and terror of the sublime directed to a great moral cause. Can cities be sublime, the urban sublimes? On the screen here, a watercolour of the Midlands industrial city of Dudley, that in Turner's time was one of the great centres of manufacturing, and it had been at the heart of Britain's industrial revolution. Can cities be sublime? Was there an urban sublime? Well, of course they can, and of course there can. In photography, film, and books, New York is perhaps one of the places where we can come closest, or have been able to come closest, to a modern sublime experience. Its immensity, its height, its energy, its sense of infinite possibility, but also its ability to be perhaps more frightening to people than almost anywhere else, and its appearance as a setting of endless disaster movies and war, films of wars and apocalypses of one kind or another. These are all, of course, modern versions of sublime imagery. But of course, as soon as I say that, I realize it sounds rather old-fashioned because, and sorry, America, New York is already being overtaken by the megacities of Asia and elsewhere. Sao Paulo, for example, or Mumbai, the maximum city for a recent Indian author, or perhaps Shanghai. And I suppose New York was the maximum city for the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century. London was the New York of the early 19th century. Of course, it was low rise, but in the eyes of not only its inhabitants, but for many foreign visitors, it was Babylon, Nineveh, Carthage, Rome, or Athens combined, all those things for the modern world. And of course, London was Turner's birthplace. It's where he lived and where he had his studio. Not the least of London's mysteries was that its vastness was known and sensed, but often invisible, lost in smoke and fog. We don't have London fogs anymore, now that smoke pollution has been controlled, but I can just about remember them. So thick and yellow, they were known as pea soupers, and that street and car lights had to be turned on during the middle of the day, and people needed torches to see where they were going. Their memory lingers on in novels and films. I don't know whether you can still buy overcoats here in the States with the label London Fog, but I hope so, because it's an evocative brand, not only for rainwear, but for the city after which it was named. Turner, Monet, and Whistler all loved London fogs, which lent romance to the Thames, if not to the dangerous streets. People often preferred London when its buildings were black, as they looked grander and more powerful as they loomed out of the haze. They thought the city looked better when you couldn't see it in detail. Maybe, but those fogs could also kill you. And there again, there's the fear factor associated with the sublime. Today, it's what you can't see that kills you in cities, not what you can. But in Turner's time, it was coal, as well as factories and domestic chimneys belching out smoke and filth and pollution and turning rain black with smuts. There were the steamboats that were appearing on the Thames, puffing out smoke and dirt, churning up the river, destroying its banks, and threatening smaller craft. And then, of course, also there were the railways that were beginning to snake through the city. And with steam and smoke came speed and new technology, new industry. Dudley was where the first iron steamboat was built. It had to be carried by land until it got to any water, but nevertheless that's where it was first built. And it was also the site of the first working steam engine in 1712. Waterloo Bridge, here on the Thames in London, was where the first Thames-built steamship was built and launched in 1832. And that brings me to the end of what I would like to talk to you about tonight, the mechanical sublime. How Turner turned the kind of things that he sees in this picture. You can see these smoking chimneys, you can just see sketched here through the fog and the mist, the faint outlines of the steamboats on the river. But here we see a steamboat off the coast of Scotland, Staffa, Fingal's Cave, painted in 1831. A marvellous picture where you have this sinking sun, you have mist, fog, rain, rough sea, black smoke from the steamboat as it churns its way through the water. And here in the exhibition, one of the last works you see as you walk around the show, this spectacular picture of a steamboat in a snowstorm off a harbour's mouth, painted in the early 1840s, the picture of which Turner claimed he had had himself tied to the mast of this particular boat so that he could watch the storm taking place. And he said he didn't know whether he was going to survive, but if he did, he would come back and paint a picture. Well, I don't think that ever happened, because nobody's ever been able to find evidence of a steamboat of the name Ariel, which Turner said this ship was called, sailing in British waters at the time Turner painted the picture. And moreover, he had nicked the story of an artist tying himself to a ship's mast to observe a storm from the biography of a French 18th century painter, Claude Joseph Vernet. Nevertheless, it made a good story, and it communicated to people the idea that what Turner was painting was actually true and real, and that he had witnessed it. It's this extraordinary image of wind, rain, wind, rough seas, light, mist, fog, and the steamboat with its sort of paddle wheels and its filthy chimney, filthy smokestack, churning its way through the water. And of course, the question Turner's asking is, will the storm win or will the boat win? And so here in this late picture, you have the natural energies, the elements, the natural energies of the world we live in, and the energies of the things we have made to fill the world. And unfortunately not in the exhibition, but it will make a conclusion, I think, rain, steam and speed, the very title of which captures the sort of dramatic energies that were taking over the world in Turner's lifetime. This is an engine of the Great Western Railway crossing a new railway bridge at Maidenhead across the Thames. And running in front of it is a small hare. And here the question, just as the question in the steamboat, the harbour's mouth is, which will win, the boat or the storm? The question here is, will the train or the hare run faster? Will the hare be able to run faster than the train, or will the train catch the hare up? The engine is a Firefly, so-called, the model introduced onto the Great Western in the early 1840s, and Turner sort of emblematizes its brand name visually by the red glow of its coal-fired boiler. And we can see its speed from the little puffs of steamy smoke that are receding in the distance. The speed of this train at the time would have been about 50 miles an hour. Extraordinary when you were used to travelling by horse or by foot or in slow mail coaches and so on. And, you know, like steamboats, which would reduce the journey time across the channel, for example, to a matter of hours instead of days, and trains which reduce your journey times around Britain. It's a time of great transformation and man-made energies that were overtaking the natural energies of something like the hare or something like the snowstorm. Anyone who's travelled on a modern British train can only regret that trains like this in Turner's lifetime were such marvellous innovations. We invented railways, and we have also let them sink into the most appalling mess and muddle. And the only question you ask yourself if you get on a British train today and go any distance is whether you'll reach your destination, or whether you might perhaps have to transfer to a bus. And buses are not a sublime experience. Thank you very much.